Okay.
Yay. Who's hosting?
I don't know, and I don't know if we came up with an agenda yesterday either. Did we?
We did come up with an agenda. Hayden, do you want to host? Meanwhile, I'll add the agenda.
Yeah, go for it. I seem to be very good at just stumbling into quiet rooms and talking anyway. It's my thing. My children constantly complain that they just hear grumbling from my office. Yeah, so there is a doc, if you wouldn't mind signing in on the doc as kind of our usual process. And there's a bunch of things that we wanted to just get through. First is a builder config RFC. Now, Sambhav, you wrote this. I know a bit about it because this is something that I think we incubated internally in Bloomberg, and I think it's a really good idea because we've been using it. Do you want to introduce it?
Oh,
now we've got the standing items.
Yeah, I was just
Right.
copying those. I don't know if we do release planning in this meeting anymore or not. Or
no, I think we did that yesterday.
Okay. So straight up to the RFC then.
Cool.
Let me share my screen. Second. Okay, there we go. So I think at some point we discussed this in a back meeting, which I've linked to here with the appropriate timestamp if people want to go back later and have a bit more insight into the motivation. The idea is that right now there's quite a few build packs that are like almost all of our build packs are configured either via environment variables or via the presence of some files. Now, quite a few of these build packs have very similar logic, except for maybe for some use cases or for some enterprises, you want to be able to set or default some behavior in the build packs using environment variables. And currently, you're not able to do that because the lifecycle strips out any environment variable except for a bunch of allow listed ones. The file version is like still somehow doable because you can inject these files in the build image, and if the build pack or like the tools that respect them find them in the appropriate place, they'll use them. But that's not true for environment variables, which are just stripped away during the detect and build process. So the idea behind this RFC is, like, let's say you have a common set of build packs in a builder and you want to customize it for different environments. So let's say you have a builder that you use for like general internet, but when you're using the same builder in the enterprise context, you want to set environment variables to modify like what your Go proxy configuration looks like, or your pip index URL, or you want to default some behavior of the build pack which is configured by environment variables. So let's say externally, the build pack during its detect phase looks at a file name called foo, but you can change that value that it looks at using some environment variable to bar. So the idea was like to provide some way for builders or build images to specify a set of environment variables that are available during build and detect. The other sort of motivation was that these variables, if needed, can take precedence over the user provided inputs. So again, this comes down to more of a security concern where like individual build packs, if they choose to, they can ignore user provided environment variables by setting the clear env flag in their build pack toml. But there's no way for the operator to enforce that, hey, only use these environment variables and disregard the user ones. So it also sort of plays a bit into that. And the proposal is that similar to our env directory that we have for build packs, introducing something very similar for build images. So you can define a CNB build config env directory where you can, again, put key value pairs where the key is the name of the environment variable plus an action if needed. And the value of the file is the value you want to set the environment variable to. There's a slight difference though. The default behavior for the value, so if you don't specify an action, is .default. So it will not override the user provided environment variables in the platform. Only if you explicitly set it to override will it override it. And similarly for prepend and append, like it will just prepend and append to the user provided environment variables. And that's pretty much the RFC. I also have a reference implementation in case people want to understand a bit more of what it's doing. But yeah, it's not anything too complicated. So this can also potentially be implemented as a build pack, or at least parts of it can be. So you can definitely set build time environment variables using a build pack that's the first build pack in a group. That doesn't let you set detect time environment variables. It also doesn't let you modify user inputs for other build packs. The other option is that each build pack that you ever use goes through a shim that sets this during detect and build for every build pack that you have, which is an alternative implementation I have here. But when I was speaking about this with the Paketo folks, a lot of them were like, if possible, this might be a functionality that is provided more widely in the lifecycle rather than at a build pack implementation library level. And I think that's all the context in this RFC.
I thought I had posted a comment on this RFC where I was trying to understand sort of, oh, it is there.
Yeah.
I guess we're reviewed back. Okay, so portability is something that you're aiming for in this part. Okay.
Yeah, so like this thing here is like possible in a lot of ways. You can also implement it at a platform level where like you have some like pack default environment variables or something that you can set for every build. Or there are like lots of ways to do this. I think the lifecycle one is the most consistent way of achieving this. The other question I'd gotten was like the overrides one, but I think I clarified the RFC a bit more.
This makes a lot of sense to me. I think there's lots of situations where like you want to configure build packs differently, rather than on a per build basis, sort of like at a higher level for all users. It's interesting because we like almost have an interface that already does this, which is why I think it does make sense to do this in the life cycle, like how we process the user envdir. It's like you could almost use the existing interface, except that we tell people to like mount over all of platform with the user provided environment variables. It's almost like, yeah, I'd want to do something here that's as similar to that as possible. It's like these ones are ones that we bake in, or like here are multiple mount points, like put your user ones here, but I'm curious like to what extent we can make it arbitrary so that we don't have to say like this is exactly the one place for this one use case. It's like we could, you know, you could extend it at various points that we haven't imagined yet, but it's like user mount yours here. Anything else that's like in this structure, we will also treat this way, whether it got there because we've baked it into the builder, which maybe we, you know, eventually provide a mechanism to allow people to do, or it's like a platform deciding that it's going to mount its one, like I always mount this here, which is sort of, I think was the original intention of the platform directory, but that requires you to merge stuff with the user's input in a way that's actually not that easy. Like it's not as well designed as it could be.
Yeah. So are you saying like take the platform directory idea, the fact that you have environment variables and bindings in there. I don't want to introduce the bindings concept to the builder because people will likely put secrets in there if they can, because they'll be like, oh, this build pack lets me configure like the secret file using bindings. Let me just put it in the builder for everyone to use. So like I wanted to limit it to like environment variables for a reason, because at least the build pack, like the build pack documentation wouldn't be like, hey, put this as an environment variable. It will always be like, put this as a binding, and there's like a clear distinction that bindings are only user provided and can never be baked into the builder. So the only other thing that leaves us with is this environment variable directory. And we already have like the same directory structure in build packs, in platform env, and in this builder config env. So if you even if you look at the reference implementation, there's not much different I'm doing there. Like it's literally reusing the existing code. So if you change one, I'm guessing the others will also change. The only difference is the default behavior if you don't provide an action. In the build packs case, it overrides. In the platform case, there are no actions. It's always override. There's no prepend, there's no append, there's no default. And in this case, default action is like set it only if it's unset.
I guess it's like just close enough that I'd almost want to eliminate the differences. It's like you could, I like default being the default.
Default, yeah.
Yeah. And like maybe you want to do that for users too, because users aren't usually like creating this directory structure. So if you wanted their default to be override, like you could do that in whatever interface they're providing the stuff in, rather than at this level in the lifecycle interface. It's like when things are exactly the same but slightly different, it's like more annoying than if they're literally the same.
Yeah, the platform env directory also does some other special things. So if the user sets a path variable, instead of overriding it, it will prepend to it. So like if it comes across the POSIX environment variables, it prepends without any preference to whatever the user said. And if it comes across non-POSIX variables, it will override.
Yeah, we probably should have made that more consistent when we made those changes in the in the build pack and interface as well, right?
This was also super confusing to me because I view user input as the first thing that is provided like as input. So like the user provided an input and then all your build packs ran, right? So like the user provided an input, those are the values of the environment variables then. So then all the build packs have run, and like each build pack, when it's running, it's able to modify the context of the following build packs using default and override, except for the platform variables. Like those things just accumulate.
It actually can't change the user input. The user input gets applied last every time.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's weird to
Yeah.
me. Like from a user's perspective, like they're providing those input variables first. Then like each build pack is saying, hey, I set these environment variables. But like for the next build pack that's completely unaware of it, it's like, I'm going to ignore all the previous build packs thought. I'm just going to see what the user thought and use that. So like if I want to take the user input and like append some arguments to it to make it conform to certain like security settings that my subsequent build packs are using, I have no way of doing that.
Yeah. Any justification I give for it is going to be like just retroactive, because I think these decisions even predate my involvement in the project. This was like OG prototype decisions that we just never changed.
And
But if I was trying to post hoc justify it, it would be, as a user, when I'm setting env, if by the time my build pack, the one I'm focusing on, runs, the thing I passed isn't there, it can be confusing. And then you need to learn about literally every other build pack in the system to try to figure out where it's changing.
But you sort of already enable that for like non-user inputs. So if some build pack is setting other environment variables, subsequent build packs can modify it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not saying I really believe that. That would be the case for it though.
Yeah.
I'm okay with this if we think this is the best path forward. I feel like the question I would ask is, can we do anything to eliminate minor differences between very similar structures? And then do we want, instead of going from 1 to 2, do we want to go from 1 to n somehow? It's like if, you can have any number of directories in this structure and they get applied, so that, if maybe there were like 2 extension points, like maybe someone wants to put something in the builder, but then the platform wants to inject other things later, it could work.
But that's already accounted for, right?
Well, it's all sort of like merged in this one directory, right? Build config env. No.
Platform ends up in /platform env. Build config is things provided to the build image. So the user inputs end up in platform env always. Build config ends up in build config, and the build pack environment variable directories are build pack environment variable directories.
I guess it's like even before the build packs run.
Yes.
Do we want like an arbitrary number of extension points here? It's like not just user and build config. It's like user and
what else would there be?
So like you could imagine the builder, having the build config baked into it. But now imagine like pack wants to always set X number of pack environment variables. Right now it like either merges them into user, but you don't know which ones at that point are really user versus really platform, or it's, it's going to mount over build config and then you've lost your builder provided ones.
But that's the same argument for Project Toml, right? Like Project Toml also allows you a way to do that. And like you can also specify it using pack command line options. But like you might want to have some pack defaults enabled. At the end, it's a platform concern, right? Like how it's mounting everything. Like there's no new concept that's being introduced. Builder is a separate concept owned by the operator. Platform is owned by whoever owns the platform. And then you have the application owner. right now the application owner doesn't have any way of setting environment variables except telling the platform to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not saying that I have a third option here. It's just like, if it's easy enough to support N versus 2, like maybe we want to consider it. It's like, here's a directory, and then you put a directory underneath it, and then env under that. And then, you can mount arbitrary ones in the future, sort of like what we do with bindings, where the name of the binding directory doesn't really matter, but if you stick it under binding, then anything underneath it is treated as a binding, and it's sort of just open-ended for how it could be used in the future.
There's an alternative strategy for the end option. I think Jesse and I had sort of touched on it at some point, where it would be nice if some of the sort of path parameters for the lifecycle actually worked like the path option on POSIX, right? Where you could put a colon and then be able to pass multiple paths to it. And then it would do a sort of lookup or apply based on sort of the order of those different paths. So you could achieve the same thing with just one argument. So that's sort of just a general idea. In this discussion, the thing that comes to my mind that I maybe want to look into a little bit deeper is order of precedence. And it seems like there's a certain sort of like keyword or functionality that's desired to essentially freeze a value and not allow for any further sort of elements to be able to overwrite that particular value.
Yep.
So I think the order of precedence might be easier to solve for. I think the freezing of a variable, I don't know that I want to attach it to it being from a build config, right? Especially if we're saying that there's n places where things come from. I think maybe there's value in having a different keyword.
Ideally, for me, the order is I trust the user inputs the least. So they should have the lowest precedence. Then it should be like the build packs, because that's what's modifying or running things. And then builder is a combination of build packs with a base environment. So whoever created the builder knows about the build packs, their behavior, and also wants to inject other modifications on top of it. So purely from a security perspective, my preferred order would be user, build pack, and then builder.
Yeah, and I think it's the opposite from a platform's perspective, right? From a platform, you sort of view as the user's input as the desire for them to have something, and you sort of defer the trust onto that.
Yeah, you start with the user's input as what they desire, and then the build pack may choose to do whatever it wants with it. Like that's what's in the spec right now. Like the build pack can completely choose to ignore all of those environment variables. And like that's a flag we've enabled because of security concerns. So you can set clear env equals true, and all the user inputs will be discarded. Like it's literally a trade-off between like trusting the user versus zero trust. And like for me at least, like I operate in the zero trust model, especially when it comes to build packs. So like I want build packs to be able to control the build process. Like if I wanted to provide that extensibility to user, the build pack can choose to do that, but there should always be a way for the build pack to enforce that behavior. So like it can choose to give precedence to the user input, but it should never be forced to always choose the user input.
Yeah. So I guess maybe, I definitely don't argue that there's value in that, specifically for certain use cases. I think for me, like tying the override keyword with order of precedence and sort of having to align both of those doesn't seem like the best possible option versus like a hypothetical, you know, again, I'm just going to throw out some keyword, right? But if we had, instead of override, something like frozen, constant, explicit, whatever keyword you want to throw on there, right? And basically in whatever the order of precedence is that we ultimately either define or allow the platforms to set, right? Again, kind of going back to the life cycle, having multiple paths. Immutable, thank you, Aiden. That makes sense. Then basically nobody else could override it, right? From that point forward.
Yeah, so there's the override one, which is one aspect of it. The other is prepend and append, and the order of prepends and appends. So like, do you want the variable to start with one value and then other things to prepend to it? So that will also follow some precedence order. So like, you started with the user values, then you prepended the build pack values, then you prepended the builder values versus any of these other orders. So it's not just for overwrite, it's also for prepend and append.
Yeah. Well, I guess, do we have reference to the current sort of order?
So the current order is user inputs if clearenv is set to false. That overrides everything. It never prepends or appends. And then for build packs, it works in the order that the build packs run. So the first build pack may set a default, prepend or override, or append, and then the subsequent build pack that runs has the next, like, has higher precedence. So if the next build pack sets an override, it will override the previous value. Right. Or if the next build pack does a prepend, it will prepend to the previous value. Except for user provided variables, which again makes very little sense to me. Like, why so much trust? And it's either like remove the user environment variables entirely or trust them. So it's like 0 or 100, there's nothing in the middle.
Yeah,
I could agree with that, that they should have a lower precedence. I'd like to couple that with making default the default, because I don't think you want to override the user's will by accident, right?
I agree.
Yeah, it sounds like we've got the ball rolling on this discussion, which is great. And I know that there's 2 other things on the agenda for today, so I'm going to jump in and push people to maybe talk about. Oh, got one more thing, Sambhav, do you?
Yeah. Before we do that, any next action items on this RFC? I do want to close it or come to some conclusion on it as soon as possible, because this is currently an open security hole for us.
Yeah, I'll be ready to approve. I think you answered my one question.
The discussion we had did raise another question for me, which is around how this interacts with clearenv.
Yep.
What happens in the clearenv case?
So clearenv, again, I assumed was something that we did out of security concerns, where we assume that we don't want to trust the user input. This is something that the builder has set, or set in the build image. So I'm assuming this is trusted. So clearenv doesn't unset previous build packs environment variables. It only unsets user provided ones. So I just followed the same analogy. So if you're trusting the previous build packs, you're trusting the builder.
In the case where you get clearenv, or in every case, we do give the user provided environment variables to the build pack, but we give them in the directory, in the platform directory.
Yes.
I think we could keep doing that.
That's still done.
Yeah, just checking. I've never totally understood clearenv. My understanding was that it wasn't so much about security, it was about like configuration of build tools. It's like maybe the build pack, like let's say you're setting something, an environment variable that's meant to configure a tool that the build pack is running. But if the build pack itself is like, written in the same language or something, but you don't want the build pack to respect the environment variable, like that is where clearenv comes in. But this is me like remembering conversations we had 2 years ago. I know Paketo build packs use this. I don't really know exactly what the use cases are.
Yeah, I mean, this comes from, I think, like Heroku, right?
You're not audible, Terrence.
Yeah, you're really right.
I'm quiet. Loud.
Yeah, now it's better.
Sorry. This comes from, I think, Heroku, because we wanted a way to basically not like have access to the environment variables. Like you can still read them from the directory. So yes, they're not set. So like if you have a bash build pack, for instance, right? Like if all those environment variables are set, it means like every single thing I do inside that build pack has those environment variables, like for any kind of command I run. So clearenv basically gives freedom to the build pack to choose when to basically source them or not. I mean, there are definitely some bash build packs that I think were written at Heroku where it will just sources the entire directory. But even when a clearenv set, you have basically the choice to do that or not, right? Like kind of where do you want to inject them? So I think it is to some degree sometimes security thing, but then also to Emily's point, like build tool configuration, right? Where it's like if I am setting, say, like private credential thing for a bundler or something, I can choose to source the environment in that one step, but not like everything else where I potentially may shell out.
Yeah, I think one of the examples that comes to mind was like a Java ops or something like that, where it was intended to be applied to the Maven process, but in the build pack, there's a couple other Java processes that are like, I think even just checking the version, and then suddenly they take 2 gigs of RAM to check the version. So you can sort of selectively pick them.
Not a huge concern for me when it comes to approving this, but I think folks that use Clear should take an extra look to make sure that the way this behaves would meet those needs.
Yeah.
It's like if you're then sourcing the user provided stuff on purpose afterwards, like are you getting really different behavior than when the lifecycle applies the user provided environment variables, and does that matter to you?
Cool. So is the next step then obvious, Sambhav?
Yeah, I guess I'll add people who use clearenv to take a look at this, but apart from that, is
Fantastic.
there anything else?
Cool. So we've also got the RFC to hopefully finally put to bed. I need a link to that.
I was going through comments on that this morning. It seems like, thank you all for leaving suggestions and helping like leave suggestions that make this look more final. I don't think there are like huge outstanding sticking points. It seems like in most of these threads where a question is raised, everyone appears to be on the same side of the answer, and then we could just roll with that. It's like we can happy to add a minimum voting window of a week, happy to apply the lazy consensus process to team RFCs as well. And is anyone aware of like an outstanding source of contention, or is it just like I should update the RFC with the results of these threads?
Yeah, I think the lazy consensus across the board was the only one that could be, but it seems like everybody's aligned on that, just being consistent.
I guess there was one thread about one of my examples being a major refactor. Javier brought up that it's subjective and it should be a judgment call for leads and maintainers. I think that's sort of the intention of what's in there. It's like major is inherently subjective. But I could clear up that wording if that felt like a sticking point.
I mean, were you thinking of like the restructuring in pack where everything moved under package or something like that? Is that kind of what you had in mind, where it didn't touch anything else, but it was major?
I'm explicitly calling out. Yeah, I want this to apply to things that are consumed as libraries. So if you're like refactoring your package structure when those packages are, importable is an interface. And we should be treating it like that. That's sort of what I'm getting at. But also, like, if you're going to, radically overhaul a library that 20 people are all actively contributing to, it'd be probably good to have a team level RFC just to get some consensus that everyone's okay with that direction. But I think it's subjective in that sense. So it's like, if it has a big impact on consumers, I think we should have an RFC. Or if it affects enough contributors in a big enough way, it's probably worth having a conversation about it.
Do we consider every Go package a library? Because in theory, you can import it. So therefore, there's like consumer at not necessarily the project level, but like at, I guess, that language level.
I think we should
like I don't
probably
think
be
we
more
recognize that
careful about what we
Yeah.
do, because you can move packages under internal and then people can't import them. So I think we should be putting more things under internal if we're not treating them with a level of care that we would treat something that we expect people to import. I don't know that we do that right now, but I think that'd be an ideal end state. And then anything that's importable should be treated with that level of care.
Yeah, I agree. I say putting it under package, I think, implies that we are exposing it as an external interface.
So just move everything under internal.
Yeah.
Don't need RFCs.
Yeah. Except for things where we're like explicitly doing that, like libCNB being the obvious example, but also people use Pack as a library. And I think,
Yeah, it would be a shame if more things went under internal in Pack, because it's really helpful that so much of it is in package. So I know that's challenging to support, but there's great value that comes with it.
Yeah, but we don't want to support like literally the surface area of everything. So like being deliberate about it, I think, is good.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I think this is probably less problematic than what it appears to be. Because in most cases, when people update, the library, it's not like an API, right? It's not like an interface. People update, let's say, the pack as a library that they're using for their application. And obviously things may shift or changes may happen, but they could always pin to a very specific version without a problem. That being said, it's really hard to know how people use, Pack or like certain code within Pack itself. So we have gotten feedback in the past of, different contributions of things that they want to do that I don't think that we could have sort of forecasted any of that or foreseen any of that. And so that makes it difficult. So for me, that's the part where it makes it really difficult to say like, oh, let's put an RFC about how we want to structure this without really knowing exactly how it's going to be used, versus something like libCNB that is sort of really intended to be, a sort of framework, right? Pack is not really a framework.
I would also argue anything that's zero work, like you can make breaking changes to it, because that's like what the Go community expects. If it's zero work, don't expect any backwards compatibility. If it's V1, then yes, like every major version bump is a backwards incompatible change. So for me, that's like the breaking point. If you're doing like V1, V2, V3 of something, then like, yes, RFC for that. Like if you're making, like if you're reordering a few files here and there.
Do we feel like the subjectivity, like to get back to the RFC, the subjectivity of this bullet point, which says any major refactor that affects consumers of our libraries or materially impacts contribution? I think, is that like an intention we can all agree with? I know it's not like a rule you could apply. It's, a suggestion to make a judgment call.
Yep.
But is that like a suggestion that we're all on board with?
I made a small change where it says any substantive change to the project requires an RFC, I changed that. Or I suggested that we should rename it to should require an RFC. So
We do
like,
that too.
yeah. I
Like this
remember
is all inherently a little wishy-washy, right? Like there's no, you can't just apply this like it's more like the law than like a piece of code, you know?
I remember because last time this bit is because when we were doing the life cycle, the source epoch date change, I don't remember what the environment variable was, but it was like all changes to life cycle must have an RFC. Like even though we were all agreeing on the fact that, hey, this needs to be implemented, we still had to go through the RFC process because that's what it said there with the must. So I just want
To be fair, I think that's probably the right call because we keep having conversations where we go back to it and we link to it. And it's like, oh, why do I decide to do it here and not there? And maybe we want to like amend it. So, but yes,
that's why
let's
I'm
leave
doing
ourselves some breathing room, right?
Yeah.
Like this is going to be implemented by humans.
Yeah.
Cool. And Javier, I think you were the one who made the comment on the thread. Is the where we are now where you wanted us to be?
Sorry, in regards to what?
In regards to just the phrasing of this change in the RFC.
Oh yeah, I definitely accepted that. Yeah, I'm comfortable with saying major is sort of subjective.
Cool. It sounds like, Emily, we've reached reasonable consensus on this, and the next step then should be hopefully straightforward.
Yeah, I'll just make all these edits we agreed to, and then we can ship it.
Fantastic. And then I suspect, Natalie, this is next agenda item is yours, if time. Spec PRs for Docker files phase 2.
Yes, I did. I added this. I think we have time. Let me share my screen. Sorry, I'm just looking. This one. Okay. You can see Chrome here. Hold on, I was looking at the life cycle. Okay, I made these PRs. I need to update both of them with small changes,
So
but
hold on a second. I can't see anything on screen yet. I'm wondering if others are in the same position.
oh, your screen sharing is paused. Why is it paused? Resume share. I keep clicking resume share and nothing happens.
Do you need one of us to screen share?
Let me try it one more time.
As my children can attest, I just shout more loudly at the computer and then it works.
Does this work? You can see the.
Yes. Yeah.
So I just wanted to take everyone on a brief tour and kind of talk about some of the things that some of the like problems that had to be solved here. So these, again, we already merged the changes for phase 1, which is the ability to switch the run image. And these are the changes that are necessary to make it possible to extend the build image. So what did I do? Okay, so I added in phase 1, we said that you could have your generated directory could have a run directory with Docker files in it. Now you can have build Docker files, and you additionally can have extend config files, which would be the file that contains your args, your build args. I tried to make it a little generic here because this is defined in the build pack API, but it's the same concept as with run Docker files. They get output by the build pack, and then they're copied to the generated directory. And then the restore changes are kind of interesting. we had talked about in a couple working groups, the fact that currently with Conico, the registry creds, if they're present on disk in the container where Conico is running, could be read by Docker files or like the Docker file instructions. And so to avoid that, there are two changes basically that we need to make to Conico, and I'm going to submit the PRs today, hopefully. The first is that if the extender is present in the builder image, you don't need to unpack any file system because it's already there. And as a result, the Conico doesn't need registry access because there's nothing to pull, right? However, in order to, correctly determine what the cache key should be and do a bunch of other things, Conico needs access to the manifest and the config file for the image, that it's referring to as the current base image. And so that the restorer needs to do, right? Like I thought about putting it in the analyzer, but restore is a little bit more efficient because you might not need extensions. And then for whatever reason, if your builder image isn't on the registry that you've given the lifecycle access to, like your build would fail and you actually never needed to pull the builder image to begin with. So anyway, that's what this build image is for. And all of this is just formatting because my IDE fixes the table borders, but I did add, this is also a little weird. So when the restore pulls the manifest and the config for the builder image, it has to put it somewhere. I'm saying it's just going to put it in that Conico cache directory, and the end user or the platform operator doesn't really need to know anything about how the directory is structured. It just needs to know that there's a Conico directory that's going to get stuff put into it that will be used later in the build. And I think I put that here, must copy, yeah, for build image to Conico cache. Those are the restore changes. Any questions so far or comments? We have 3 minutes left. Otherwise, I'll just breeze through the rest. The extender, I need to make a small change to allow the platform to configure the cache TTL. But otherwise, these are all the inputs that it requires. The reason why it needs things like build packs and plan and GID and UID are sort of like the creator. The extender is gonna extend the builder image in the container that is running, and then it will drop privileges using the provided GID and UID and just run the build phase. So if you have extensions, you don't need to run the builder container. And this, I guess, it avoids having to, export the extended builder image and then bring up a new container from that extended image, although you could do that. But this just seemed more efficient. And yeah, like made a comment there. And that's it for the platform changes. And I guess we only have 2 minutes left, but the build pack changes are pretty straightforward. I want to make one small change to what's here. I think Joe left some comments about I need to update a must to a should. But one more thing I want to do is somewhere in here we say that an extension gets all the same variables as a build pack during its generate phase, except for CNB layers, dear. And I want to change that to say, like it, in addition to not getting CNB layers, dear, and getting CNB output, dear, instead of getting a CNB build pack, dear, it should get a CNB extension, dear, because that's just weird. But then other than that, these are all, enumerating the requirements of a build.docker file, and describing the schema of the extend config for the build arcs. And that's it.
Fantastic. No, thanks for running us through that, Natalie. I suggest that if people have questions, that we take them into the Slack chat or hold them until next week, because I know some people have to get off for meetings on the hour. But if you do have to get off for meetings on the hour, ciao. Otherwise, if you got time, maybe hang on and talk to Natalie. Cool. The audience is yours, Natalie.
Oh, I actually have a meeting on the hour. So
Thank you, Aiden, for keeping us on track.
yeah.
No problem. Okay, I'll see you all next time.
See ya.